we're going to move now from the data-oriented section of the academic track to the contribution dynamics, I would call it, oriented. And specifically, we're going to hear and see two talks about corporate editing in OpenStreetMap. And we're going to start off with Benny. Benny and his colleagues from the GI Science Research Group / Higet at Heidelberg. And they're gonna show us an analysis of what corporate editors are doing at multiple resolutions, spatial resolutions. So go ahead, Benny.
Okay, good. Thanks, Yair, for that kind introduction. So the work I'm going to present today is a bachelor thesis that has been written by Lily Tockner. So I'm presenting her work now a bit condensed, what she has been working on for a few months, into this 20-minute talk roughly. And we are going to take a look at how corporates have mapped in OpenStreetMap. And this research was guided by two questions. First, we were looking at corporate mapping on the global scale. You might have seen or read already a few research papers or also attended talks and past status map conferences that this is an ongoing debate or maybe like interesting topic in OpenStreetMap. Corporate mapping evolved over the time, and we wanted to check, okay, how did it change, or what are the most recent changes since the other papers have been written or the talks have been given. So that's the global scale. And then we wanted also to take a look at more local and small scale mapping. So zooming in now, and we pick a few countries and try to now really come up with a detailed spatial and temporal contribution pattern from corporate mappers. Okay, let's start with number one then. So how did we do this? So first we used a new data set. There was a workshop at this conference as well. So we call it the contributions data set or the OSM data insights. If you have missed our workshop, you can check the link also in the program. Basically, this data set combines OpenStreetMap history database with the change set database. So you have every change in OpenStreetMap, like the previous version and the next version kind of together. And then we merge the information from the change set, where you have information like which editor was used, was there a particular hashtag used, or any comments used. So we brought those two in OSM, usually separate things together, and generated a big data set that we used for this analysis. And this data set contains a lot of attributes, so easy things, or the things that you are used to know or used to work with, like OpenStreetMap ID, the change set closing timestamp, the hashtags, user IDs, of course, tags, the tags before, the geometry, centroid. We add a country code. So this data set makes research, I would say, quite easy. And that's also what Lily used here in her bachelor thesis. So we gave her like 500 gigabytes of OSM data and let her play around a bit, and you can see what came out. Okay, so once we had that data set established, we needed to define how do you actually track corporate mapping in OpenStreetMap. And there are two approaches that you can use. So one is using corporate hashtags in the change set comment. And most companies follow that approach. So they set up their own hashtag and they constantly use it. And then it's a relatively easy way to track how much and where they map. Not all companies do that, unfortunately. So when you want to take a look at mapping done by corporate mappers from Meta, they use several hashtags, but it's not really consistent that you can say this is a hashtag and then you get contributions from Meta. So there you rely on a different approach where you have to go by individual user ID. And this is a bit more complicated because you have to first find out which users actually map for Meta. So you can check the OSM wiki in the editing, organized editing guidelines. Every company has to document which mappers are mapping for them. But you scrape the website, get the user IDs that work for Meta, and then try to extract all contributions from these users. It's a bit more a hassle, I would say. Luckily, there's some open source scripts, GitHub repositories out there. One from Pete Brömmel is very useful, where we could just take his scripts and get these user IDs. So in total, we looked at 24 companies, including Apple, Card, Amazon, Microsoft, TomTom, Grab, yeah, you name them, right? So we had a long list of companies that we considered in this analysis. Okay, and then, okay, first thing, maybe I should have mentioned the time span. So we looked at 1st of June 2019 to 31st of May 2023, so 4 years time span. That was what we considered. And we grouped now the number of contributions per country, and that's what you can see on this map. The larger the circle on this map is, it means the more contributions from corporate mappers there were in that time span. And the color indicates like what's the relative proportion of corporate edits from all edits in that country. Yeah? And you see that this is a quite distinct pattern, maybe. So maybe we start with the easy thing. So in Western Europe, there is a little bit of corporate mapping going on, but its relative share on overall mapping is rather low, right? You see like the very light colors basically means the influence of corporate mapping, say in Germany or France, at least when you just count the number of contributions, is rather low. However, this is different if you take a look at other countries. And it's quite interesting, also the same, you could say, on the African continent. In general, corporate mapping is not so much happening, maybe with the exception of Tanzania. But on the other hand, you see that in Latin America, Caribbean, there's a big influence of corporate mapping in general. Like most countries do not have big circles, like a big absolute number of mapping, but also like the darker, more red colors, right? So it means like the relative share of corporate mapping in countries like Brazil, Mexico, Colombia is very high. So it's, for some of those countries, it's more than 50%. Yeah, so you could say the majority of edits in Mexico has been done by corporate mappers. Okay. So that's maybe one of the first findings we had here. You see also in Southeast Asia, like in India or Indonesia, Philippines, there's also quite a big influence of corporate mapping on the global scale. I think that was one contribution of Lily's research. I think previously we had only the absolute numbers, so the other papers you can read, usually you consider how much mapping happened, but here what she did quite nicely sets this into perspective of the overall mapping activity in OSM. Okay, so keep that footprint in mind. Let me check. Yeah, I tell you one more thing. So if you now look at socio-economic characteristics of those countries where a lot of corporate mapping happened, what you will realize is that it's not the very high income countries or very high human development index countries, and also not the very low, but it's rather the things in the middle. Yeah, so it's the high to medium income countries where it seems, at least from this map, that there's the biggest interest for corporates to map in OpenStreetMap. So you could say the emerging markets for companies like Meta or Amazon or Apple, that's probably where they focused also their mapping. Yeah. We only take a look at the data here, so I'm curious to see also the next talk that goes a bit more qualitative, but yeah, that's at least what we see from the data. Okay, we took a look at how did this change over time. Yeah, and maybe we start on the left side with the light gray bars. This is overall mapping activity in OpenStreetMap globally. So if you look at 2017, yeah, we had around 200 million contributions, changes in OpenStreetMap, and that number increased to over 300 million in 2021, and since then kind of stagnated, decreased a little bit, but I think it's now roughly around 300 million changes, contributions in OpenStreetMap happening every year. And now we set this in comparison again with how much corporate mapping happened, and you see that's also what maybe we expected. Corporate mapping increased, like from 2016, where it was basically non-existing, to 2021, where there was a peak. And maybe interestingly, what we realized that since then, it decreased, and it decreased quite rapidly, and that was something we did not expect. We had anticipated that this would steadily grow, right, and maybe make up an even bigger portion of mapping in OSM, but something seems to have changed since 2021, in particular for the very big companies like Apple and Amazon, I guess, that they map much less in OSM than previously. And that was another finding of her research that we didn't expect, so that corporate mapping actually decreased since the last few years. And to be honest, we don't know why. Maybe we can have a discussion here. On the other side of the slide, you see how this is distributed per company. So for each company, we can say how much they have mapped. And you see in particular in 2020, 2021, there's a very huge share from Apple, and that one decreased. So this influenced a lot also the global trends. You can take basically the same picture now, but not counting the number of edits, but now taking a look at the number of active mappers. And of course, that's maybe, again, we start with the light gray lines. So in OpenStreetMap, you see that this number is actually not steadily increasing as the number of edits did on the other slide. So we have somehow between 250,000 to 300,000 different people mapping in OpenStreetMap every year since 2016. And that number went up and down a bit, so there's no real trend, I would say. At best, you might want to say it's not increasing, so it's rather stagnating, some fluctuations, but yeah. So that's our global OpenStreetMap contributor base, if you want to call it like this. The share of corporate mappers on that is rather low, right? So also that's maybe to be expected. There are not so many corporate mappers, but they do a lot of edits. They are also paid for doing the edits, so I guess they will map quite fast. And on the right-hand side, again, you see how this distributes per company. So with this, you can somehow estimate what's the size, the team size, kind of the corporate have, yeah, and how many mappers they have. Overall, if you set total mappers in like comparison with corporate mappers, it's only maybe 1 to 1.5% of the entire OpenStreetMap user base, which are corporates. Like for the 24 companies that we tracked, those are the biggest ones. It might be that we might have missed 1 or 2, but so if you can take this as a ballpark number, between 1 and 1.5% of the users in OSM are corporate mappers. But they do, of course, their impact on mapping, if you count the edits, it's much higher. Okay, if you're interested in this and also want to have some up-to-date numbers for the companies that use hashtags, you can use our Awesome Now Stats dashboard. Put something like hashtag ADT, Apple Data Team, and then you will get what you see in the background, this kind of graphics and maps to really see, yeah, for a corporate that you're interested in a detailed spatial footprint, the temporal evolution, how much mapping did they do every month or every day. And you can also break this down by different types of edits. That's something we didn't consider now in the research here, but on this website you can also break it down by mapping of buildings, roads, waterways, and we have a list of 12 or more categories where we might get a better impression of what are these corporates actually doing. Okay, nice. So what are the main takeaways here? So corporate mapping increased a lot between 2016 and 2021, but since then it has decreased, and that was unexpected for us. Also, the number of corporate mappers has decreased since then, but it's mainly driven by 3 companies, Meta, Card, and Apple, that they map less now. They're concentrated in high development, high and medium human development index regions. So there's a very high and the low, it's where corporates are not mapping. And most of the edits focused on very specific countries. So we found like in 32 countries, there were 80% of all corporate edits. And if you want to take a look at the extreme cases, Qatar, Mexico, Uruguay, and Bahrain, where we have seen like the biggest share of corporate edits globally. Okay, that was number 1. So we are now fine, set the stage with a global view. So now we try to zoom in, and we picked 3 countries where there was high corporate mapping activity and that were on different continents. So we picked Colombia, Indonesia, and the United Arab Emirates. And now, until now, we first worked on the country level, and now we zoom in and we do this by utilizing the Uber H3 grid. So for each country, we split that country up in those hexagon grids. You might have seen them like on other slides maybe, and you will see them in a minute. So they are roughly the size of a small town, I would say. And for each of those grids, now we count, okay, how much corporate mapping happens there, and compare this again to the overall mapping in that hexagon, in that smaller unit. So in that sense, quite similar to what we did in the first step, but now more local. Okay. And then we did a spatial autocorrelation analysis where we tried to find clusters of high corporate mapping activity, so regions where there is a lot of corporate mapping, and also in surrounding regions there was a lot of corporate mapping. And we did the same with the normal mapping, let's call it like that, and tried how those clusters overlap, and or if they push away each other. Yeah? So that's somehow what we get. So on the left-hand side, you see the spatial footprint of corporate mapping in the United Arab Emirates, and you see it's mainly focused around Dubai, a bit about around Abu Dhabi. So this is where the corporate mapping focused, and on the other side, you see where normal mapping focused. And we did this now for all the 3 countries. So this is for Colombia. I know it's maybe a bit too small, but I put the slides also online. So for the ones of you that need to look at the details, I would like to refer to our online slides. And we also did the same for Indonesia, and there it's even more difficult to actually see something. I'm sorry for that. Okay, so but what are our main takeaways from this more local analysis? The one thing, we didn't find any strong correlation between an increase or decrease in corporate or non-corporate editing in those 3 selected countries. So what does this actually mean? So no real correlation between. So if corporate mapping increases, we can't tell you if this increases or decreases normal mapping. Yeah, so the relationship between those 2 types of contributions seems to be rather loosely coupled. So we cannot really turn the one way and then this will have an effect on the other. And what we kind of conclude from this is that, I don't know, there seems to be not a direct impact of corporate mapping. It rather not positive or also not negative on other ongoing mapping activity on OSM. So it's a bit more like separate communities that might not even interact too much with each other, at least from a data perspective. Okay, so questions that we wanted to raise for a discussion is, can we come to the conclusion that corporate editors fill the gaps left by other volunteer mapping efforts? So we know that OSM has a strong community in Western Europe, North America, and we've seen that corporates do not map there. We know, and we've seen also here, that there's a humanitarian mapping community that focus a lot on lower income countries, and it seems to be like there's not really someone focusing on the middle income countries, but corporates do. So, I don't know. That's a question for discussion, I would say, if they're filling a gap here that nobody else has considered so far. We don't know why corporates are mapping less and what is the intention, but we know that it's very unlikely that all those places they focused on are finally mapped. Yeah, so there are still gaps in high and medium income countries, but still corporates map less there. So we don't really know why this is the case. There are some limitations to our work. Not every company might use hashtags, or we rely on that they use it consistently, which is something we cannot really enforce, but we can encourage everyone to use them because this makes analysis easier. We only analyzed 3 countries here, and there were at least 30 or 32 where this would make sense because we saw these countries with a high corporate mapping activity. And we also couldn't look into what we call sequential effects or lag effects. So, I don't know, corporate mapping today might discourage normal mapping in the future. Yeah, so you might be discouraged to map, and we could not take into account this delayed effect in this analysis here. Yeah, and something for the outlook, maybe what I think should be done is also try to bring together maybe other emerging forms of mapping that also affect OpenStreetMap, like AI-assisted mapping in conjunction with corporate mapping. So that would also be something interesting. So are the meta mappers all using Rapid or not? I don't know. We haven't done this analysis, but I think it could be an interesting question for future research. Okay, that was my talk. Thanks for everyone's time.
Thank you, Benny. Interesting talk. Always nice to hear about what corporate mappers are doing. So we have one from Venuless. Well, you kind of talked a bit about it, but maybe you can hypothesize. Do you think that the decrease in corporate mapping in OSM could be accounted to the founding of Overture maps?
I would say yes, maybe, and maybe also no, but I think maybe the bigger trend is I would see more AI-assisted ways to create data. So, and Overture plays in that as well. So now with the Overture Maps dataset, there is not an incentive probably for Apple or Meta or Amazon mappers to map any buildings in OpenStreetMap anymore because they just rely on this merged OSM, Google, Microsoft building dataset. So I feel that yes, with Overture, probably this plays a role, but also only together with the AI-generated datasets that some things where they would have mapped a few years ago, maybe it's not that relevant for them at the moment.
And I think you managed to answer two questions in one, because the next one was, do you think it's possible that corporate mappers train AI with their mapping activities for the future? Yeah. So, yeah, sorry, I'm taking Venuless first. Do you also analyze what kind of objects are most frequently mapped by companies? What is, in your opinion, their main interest?
In this analysis from Lily, we didn't do this. So we just counted contributions and every change was treated the same, no matter if it was a building, a highway, or a point of interest. So I know that at least some of the big corporates like Apple or Amazon, they mapped a lot of buildings and roads primarily. But I have a hard time to say that's their focus because it's easy, I would say, to map hundreds of thousands of buildings and it's much harder to map 10,000 POIs. So I can't really tell where they put most effort. I would refer to the Awesome Now Stats dashboard where you can at least break this down by different categories or topics. And maybe somebody is also happy to follow up on that research and zoom in a bit more. Yeah.
So we'll take maybe one or two quick questions from the crowd. So, yeah. Sorry, yeah.
Thanks for this. I was curious, so you mentioned that some of the data you were looking with hashtags and some of them you were doing it based on usernames which you were collecting and scraping from another source. Do you see any difference in the performance or the sort of activity of individuals based on the sort of way that you categorize the corporation? So for example, if you're doing it in username based and it was really high in 2020 through 2022, could that be because the individuals had more time? And if it's hashtag based, it's a little bit more based on the specific application.
Okay.
Yeah, so the question was, are there differences in the patterns once you differentiate between the mappers or editors you identify using hashtags or using user IDs?
I'm not sure if I have the correct answer for this, but so I think that we did not look into mapping pattern for individual users. So once we have established these are all the user IDs for Meta, we put them into one box and say these are all contributions done by Meta. So we didn't look into further detail. I know that Lily did a little bit, at least that something that might also be interesting to explore, that we also see that individuals, some move on from one company, mapping for another, and there might be even an overlap between few companies mapping, the same person mapping for two companies at the same time, basically. Also this happens, but we haven't looked into more detail into the individual users themselves.
May I have a final
Yeah.
question?
Yeah.
So then when you're mapping, when you're identifying based on hashtags, is it that you effectively collect every user who is associated with a particular hashtag and then pull the data for all of those users? Do you effectively create a pool of users in that same way?
we didn't create a pool of users. We just say, if this change set has a hashtag, I don't know, ADT, then we consider it as a corporate contribution. And then we check how many users were there that contributed data with that hashtag, and what's the overall number of contributions that had this hashtag. So we didn't first get a hashtag and then get users and then did the stats, but we just directly took the hashtag and did the stats.
It might be interesting to
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, sorry, so we were out of time.